You have 30 days to remove that illegal dock and get off community property, or we're calling the lawyers. That's what HOA President Karen Martinez told me on the Tuesday morning that changed everything. Standing on my front porch, pointing at the dock my great-uncle built with his own hands 37 years ago, threatening to kick me out of the cabin I just bought 3 months earlier. I almost laughed at the absurdity. This woman in her ridiculous floral dress, clutching her clipboard like a weapon, actually thought she could force me out of my dream lakefront home over some made-up violations. What Karen didn't know was that she'd just picked a fight with the wrong guy. And by the time I was done with her, she'd be paying me rent to live in her own house. But let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started, because the revenge I got was so sweet, it still makes me smile every morning when I drink my coffee on that illegal dock. My name is Jake Thompson, and 3 months before Karen's little power trip, I'd bought my great-uncle Henry's cabin on Crystal Lake in Pine Valley, Colorado. At 31, I thought I'd finally made it, working remotely as a cybersecurity consultant, living in the place where I'd spent every magical summer as a kid, waking up to lake views that most people only see in vacation photos. Karen was 45, recently divorced, and had apparently decided that her new role as HOA president was going to be her ticket to respect and authority. She'd been elected just 4 months earlier by a community that was desperate for someone, anyone, to take charge of basic maintenance issues. Big mistake. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when she marched up to my door like she was leading a military campaign. She was wearing a bright floral dress that looked like it had been attacked by a garden center, clutching her clipboard like it was Excalibur, and flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Thompson," she announced without so much as a hello, "I'm here to inform you of several code violations that require immediate attention." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me? Code violations?" Karen held up her clipboard triumphantly. "Your dock is an unauthorized structure that violates our waterfront regulations. You also have unauthorized decorative lighting, and your property line has unapproved plantings that obstruct the community's sight lines." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what I was hearing. "Karen, this dock has been here since 1987. Uncle Henry built it before half these houses existed. And what decorative lighting? You mean the string lights on my porch?" Her face twisted into what I can only describe as a power-drunk smile. "Just because something has been here for a long time doesn't make it legal, Mr. Thompson. Rules are rules." That's when I noticed the other board members, Bob Chin and Lisa Rodriguez, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Bob kept shifting his weight and avoiding eye contact, while Lisa was actually shaking her head slightly behind Karen's back. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice reasonable, "if there's a legitimate safety concern, I'm happy to address it. But this dock was professionally built and maintained. And those string lights? They're decorative porch lighting. Every house in this neighborhood has similar lights." Karen's smile grew wider and more condescending. "Mr. Thompson, this isn't a negotiation. You have 30 days to remove all unauthorized structures and bring your property into compliance, or face escalated enforcement procedures." She handed me a yellow violation notice with a penalty fee of $500 and a warning that made my blood boil. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $100 and potential legal action for non-compliance. As I watched Karen march back down my driveway like a conquering general, with Bob and Lisa trailing behind her looking mortified, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about safety or community standards. This was about power, and Karen had just declared war on the wrong person. That afternoon, I did what any reasonable person would do when faced with bureaucratic nonsense. I decided to fight back with facts. I pulled out my laptop and started digging into HOA laws, property records, and community bylaws. What I found was fascinating. First, I discovered that the Pine Valley Lake Community HOA had been established in 1995, 8 years after my uncle's dock was built. The original HOA bylaws specifically included a grandfather clause protecting existing structures that predated the association. Second, I found out that Karen had been making up penalties as she went along. According to the actual HOA bylaws, violation fines required a formal board vote and couldn't exceed $50 per day without community approval. But the most interesting discovery came when I started digging into property records at the county assessor's office. My great-uncle Henry had been a meticulous man who kept detailed records of everything. When I inherited the cabin, I also inherited boxes of paperwork that I'd mostly ignored. But now, motivated by Karen's threats, I started going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. That's when I found the folder labeled Property Development Agreement, 1994. Inside was a contract that made me sit back in my chair and whistle. Apparently, when the Pine Valley development was first planned, the developer had needed to use part of my uncle's land for the community's main access road and utilities. Instead of selling the land, Uncle Henry had negotiated a ground lease agreement. The developer paid my uncle $2,000 per month for the use of his land, and when the development was complete, that lease was supposed to transfer to the HOA at the same rate, adjusted for inflation. I read the contract 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining things. According to my calculations, the HOA should have been paying my family approximately $4,200 per month for the last 25 years. But nobody had ever contacted me about continuing the lease payments after Uncle Henry passed away. Which meant the entire Pine Valley Lake community had been using my family's land for free for the past 3 years. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office with Uncle Henry's contracts and my own property deed. The clerk, a helpful woman named Sandra, listened to my story with growing amazement. "Mr. Thompson," she said after reviewing the documents, "if this ground lease is still valid, then the HOA has been in violation of their contractual obligations for 3 years. You could potentially claim back rent for the entire period." Sandra pulled out a large survey map and spread it across the counter. "Let me show you exactly what land we're talking about here." She traced the property lines with her finger and my jaw dropped. The ground lease didn't just cover the access road. It covered the community clubhouse, the main parking area, and most importantly, the land under 12 houses, including Karen's brand new McMansion. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, "that Karen's house is built on land that my family technically still owns?" Sandra nodded. "According to these documents, yes. The developer had permission to build on your uncle's land, but ownership was never transferred. This is actually more common than you'd think, especially in developments from the 1990s. I left the county office with certified copies of all the relevant documents and a plan that was going to turn Karen's little power trip into the most expensive mistake of her life. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Bob Chin and Lisa Rodriguez. I'd gotten their phone numbers from the community directory, and when I explained that I had important information about HOA finances and legal obligations, they agreed to meet me at the local coffee shop. Bob arrived first, looking nervous and apologetic. "Jake, I have to tell you, I'm really sorry about yesterday. Karen has been intense since she became president. A lot of us are concerned about her approach." Lisa showed up a few minutes later, shaking her head. "I've been on this board for 4 years, and I've never seen anything like what Karen's been doing. The violation notices, the arbitrary fines, none of it follows proper procedure." I pulled out the folder of documents and spread them across the coffee shop table. "Before we talk about Karen's procedures, I need to show you something that's going to change everything." For the next hour, I walked Bob and Lisa through the ground lease agreement, the property survey, and the legal implications of what I'd discovered. Their faces went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, embarrassment, and finally something that looked like panic. "So you're saying," Lisa whispered, "that we've been living on borrowed land this whole time, and we haven't been making the required lease payments?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," I replied. "But here's the thing, I'm not interested in kicking anyone out of their homes or causing problems for good neighbors. What I am interested in is making sure that Karen understands she picked the wrong person to mess with." Bob leaned forward, his face serious. "What do you need from us?" "First, I need you to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night. Second, I need you to invite Karen to attend so she can hear this information directly from me. And third, I need you to document everything that happens, because I have a feeling Karen isn't going to take this news very well." The Pine Valley Community Center had never been so packed. Word had somehow gotten out that there was going to be a major announcement about property rights and HOA finances, and it seemed like every resident in the neighborhood had shown up. Karen arrived fashionably late, wearing an even more ridiculous floral dress and carrying her clipboard like a weapon. She took her seat at the head table with the confidence of someone who thought she was in complete control of the situation. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency meeting," she began, her voice dripping with false authority. "I understand there are some questions about recent enforcement actions, and I want to assure everyone that the board takes community standards very seriously." Bob Chin stood up and cleared his throat. "Actually, Karen, we're here tonight because Mr. Thompson has some important information about HOA finances and legal obligations that the entire community needs to hear." Karen's confident smile faltered slightly. "What kind of information?" I stood up and moved to the front of the room, carrying my folder of documents. "The kind of information that's going to save everyone a lot of money and legal trouble, except possibly for you, Karen." The room was completely silent as I began laying out the facts. I explained the ground lease agreement, showed copies of the original contracts, and detailed exactly how much money the HOA owed my family. So to summarize, I said, looking directly at Karen, this community has been using my family's land without paying rent for the past 3 years. The current amount owed, including interest and penalties for late payment, comes to approximately $175,000. The room erupted. People were gasping, shouting questions, and several residents looked like they were about to faint. But Karen's reaction was the most dramatic of all. Her face went completely white, then bright red, then back to white again. She clutched her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and when she finally spoke, her voice was shaking with rage. "This is extortion," she screamed. "You can't just show up with some old paperwork and demand money from hardworking families. I won't let you steal from this community." "Karen," I said calmly, "I'm not stealing anything. I'm simply enforcing a legal contract that your predecessor boards chose to ignore. However, I'm prepared to offer the community a very reasonable solution." The room quieted down as everyone leaned forward to hear my proposal. "Here's what I'm willing to do," I continued. "Instead of demanding the full $175,000 in back rent, I'm prepared to forgive the debt and restructure the ground lease under the following terms. First, the monthly lease payment will be set at $6,000 per month, which is actually below current market rates for this much prime real estate. Second, instead of the HOA paying this directly, the cost will be divided equally among all households. Based on our current 48 residential units, that comes to $125 per month per household. Third, this lease will be legally binding and properly documented, which means everyone will have security and clarity about their housing situation going forward." The math was simple and fair, but Karen looked like she was about to explode. "You can't force us to pay you rent for our own homes," she shrieked. "Karen," I replied patiently, "they're not your homes. The structures are owned by individual residents, but the land belongs to my family. This is actually a very common arrangement, and $125 per month is extremely reasonable for lakefront property." Bob Chin raised his hand. "Jake, what happens to residents who can't afford the additional $125 per month?" "Great question, Bob. I'm prepared to offer payment plans, hardship exemptions for fixed-income seniors, and a 2-year phase-in period so nobody faces an immediate financial burden. The goal here isn't to hurt anyone, it's to formalize an arrangement that should have been handled properly years ago." Lisa Rodriguez stood up next. "What about HOA fees? We're currently paying $200 per month for community maintenance and services. The ground lease payments are separate from HOA fees," I explained. "However, since the lease will cover major infrastructure costs that the HOA has been absorbing, I'd expect your regular fees could actually be reduced." The room was buzzing with conversations as residents discussed the proposal among themselves. Most people seemed to recognize that $125 per month was reasonable, especially if it meant lower HOA fees and protection from future legal disputes. But Karen was having none of it. "This is blackmail," Karen shouted, standing up so quickly that her chair fell over backward. "He's trying to steal our homes with fake legal documents and intimidation tactics." That's when Bob Chin decided he'd had enough. "Karen," he said firmly, "I've seen the documents. They're not fake. The county recorder's office has confirmed everything Mr. Thompson is saying. The question is, why didn't you know about this ground lease agreement? Don't you think the HOA president should be aware of major financial obligations?" Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "I don't have to justify my leadership to you people. I was elected to protect this community from exactly this kind of exploitation." "What exploitation?" Lisa asked. "Jake is offering us a below-market lease rate and payment plans for people who need them. Meanwhile, you've been issuing fake violation notices and threatening illegal fines. Which one of you is actually exploiting the community?" That's when things got really interesting. "Fine," Karen screamed. "You want to play hardball? I'll show you hardball. Effective immediately, I'm implementing emergency measures to deal with this crisis. Monthly HOA fees are increased to $800 per household to cover legal defense costs." The room exploded in outrage. People were shouting, several residents were on their phones, presumably calling lawyers, and Bob Chin was frantically taking notes. "Karen," I said loudly enough to be heard over the chaos, "you don't have the authority to unilaterally triple HOA fees. That requires a community vote according to your own bylaws." "I'm the president," she shrieked. "I have emergency powers." "Actually you don't," Lisa said, pulling out a copy of the HOA bylaws. Emergency powers are limited to situations like natural disasters or immediate safety threats. Financial disputes don't qualify. What happened next was like watching a dam burst. Bob Chin called for an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. The motion was seconded by at least a dozen residents, and the vote wasn't even close. 43 in favor of removing Karen as president, 2 opposed, Karen herself and 1 other resident who apparently hadn't been paying attention, and 3 abstentions. Karen's reaction was predictable and spectacular. "You can't do this to me," she wailed. "I've sacrificed everything for this community. I've worked day and night to protect property values and maintain standards." By issuing fake violation notices? Someone called out from the back of the room. By threatening illegal fines? Another resident added. By trying to kick out the person whose family actually owns the land we're living on? Tanya Schmidt, a single mom from down the street, stood up with fire in her eyes. "Karen, you tried to bully the wrong person and now we're all going to benefit from it. Jake's offer is more than fair, and frankly, we're lucky he's not demanding the full back rent you apparently didn't know we owed." As the meeting dissolved into smaller groups of residents discussing the new lease arrangements, Karen made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "This isn't over," she announced to anyone who would listen. "I'm going to fight this in court. I'm going to expose this scam for what it really is." But her threats fell on deaf ears. People were already talking about forming a new board, organizing proper financial oversight, and planning community improvements that could be funded through the reduced HOA fees that would result from the new lease arrangement. 3 days later, I received a formal letter from Karen's attorney, a solo practitioner who clearly hadn't done his homework. The letter demanded that I cease and desist from harassment and intimidation of HOA residents, and threatened legal action if I continued to make false claims about property ownership. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, along with copies of all the property documents and a recording of the community meeting that several residents had made. My lawyer's response was swift and brutal, a letter detailing exactly why Karen's claims were baseless, along with a demand that her attorney review the actual property records before making any further threats. Karen's lawyer never responded. A week later, the Pine Valley Lake community held a special election for new board officers. Bob Chin was elected president by unanimous vote, Lisa Rodriguez became treasurer, and they recruited 2 other longtime residents to fill out the board. Their first official act was to approve the ground lease agreement and establish the new payment structure. Their second act was to reduce monthly HOA fees from $200 to $150, since the major infrastructure costs were now covered by the lease payments. The best part of this whole story happened about 2 weeks after the community meeting. I was sitting on my dock, the same dock that Karen had tried to force me to remove, enjoying my morning coffee when I saw a moving truck pull up to her house. Karen was leaving Pine Valley. Bob Chin came by later that day to give me the full story. Apparently, Karen had spent the weeks after her removal from the board trying to rally support for a legal challenge to the lease agreement. When she couldn't find any residents willing to join her crusade, she decided to cut her losses and move somewhere she could find a community that appreciates strong leadership. The cherry on top? Because Karen's house was built on land covered by the lease agreement, she had to pay her share of the ground lease fees right up until the day she moved out. Her mortgage company had insisted on it to protect their interest in the property. So yes, I did triple their fees overnight, but only after discovering that they'd been living on my family's land without paying rent for 3 years. And instead of demanding the full back rent they owed, I offered them a below-market lease that actually saved them money in the long run. 6 months later, Pine Valley Lake community is thriving under competent leadership. The new board has established transparent financial practices, proper procedures for addressing violations, and a community improvement fund that's already paid for playground equipment and dock repairs. My morning routine is back to normal. Coffee on the dock, stunning lake views, and the peaceful satisfaction that comes from knowing justice was served. The string lights Karen complained about? They're still there, and now they're part of an annual community lighting display that everyone contributes to. Bob Chin stops by occasionally to update me on community business, and we've become genuine friends. Lisa Rodriguez invited me to join the board, but I politely declined. I prefer my current role as the guy who makes sure nobody forgets that actions have consequences. The funniest part of this whole experience? 3 months after Karen moved away, I got a text from an unknown number. "I hope you're happy. You ruined my life over a stupid dock." I texted back, "I didn't ruin your life, Karen. I just made sure you couldn't ruin mine." Looking back on this whole experience, There are a few key lessons that I think apply to anyone dealing with HOA bullies or petty tyrants in positions of authority. First, knowledge is power. Karen's entire strategy depended on people not knowing their rights or understanding the legal reality of their situation. The moment I started doing research and asking questions, her authority began to crumble. Second, document everything. Every interaction, every threat, every violation notice, it all becomes evidence when you need to defend yourself or prove a pattern of abuse. Third, most bullies are cowards. Karen was perfectly happy to threaten and intimidate when she thought I had no recourse. But the moment she realized I had legal leverage and community support, she folded like a cheap tent. Fourth, sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Instead of just fighting Karen's bogus violations, I changed the entire game by asserting my family's legitimate property rights. It's hard to argue with someone when you're literally standing on their land. Finally, community matters. This fight wasn't just about me and my dock. It was about protecting good neighbors from a petty tyrant who was abusing her authority. When residents realized that Karen was the problem, not the solution, they stood up and did the right thing. As I write this story, I'm sitting on my grandfather's dock, watching the sunset over Crystal Lake. The water is calm, the community is peaceful, and Karen Martinez is someone else's problem now. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about what happened to Karen. The honest answer is no, I don't. She had multiple opportunities to be reasonable, to follow proper procedures, and to treat her neighbors with basic respect. Instead, she chose to abuse her authority and try to bully someone she thought couldn't fight back. I didn't destroy Karen's life. She did that herself when she decided that being HOA president gave her the right to harass and intimidate her neighbors. I just made sure that her actions had consequences. And sometimes that's exactly what bullies need. A reminder that their victims might not be as helpless as they appear, and that karma has a way of evening the score. The dock is still here. The lights are still twinkling. And every morning when I have my coffee and watch the sunrise, I'm reminded that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just protect you. It protects everyone else who might have been the next target. Karen tried to kick me out of my lake cabin. Instead, she ended up paying me rent for the land under her own house. Justice served, lakeside style.